Dan, if you want to introduce yourself, go ahead and get started. I just unmuted you, so you should be good to go.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. This is Dan Grady from Tableau. I'm a product consultant here. I've been with the company a little under a year, and I work in the product pretty much every day. So today I'm going to be explaining to you guys how to use Tableau in an optimal way, specifically with Excel. And so with that being said, I'll walk through some examples of the relationships between doing things in Excel and the equivalent in Tableau, and some things that you can do in Tableau that just aren't possible in Excel. And I'll go through some examples of what not to do, what to do, things of that nature. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And so after this session, you'll be able to connect to Tableau from an Excel file, pretty standard. We'll talk about formatting. This is really key. We'll use a lookup functionality, which is a very commonly used and very effective way to kind of use Tableau in a way that seems familiar to Excel. We'll talk about formatting conditionally, so basically color formatting, and then we'll talk about totaling, and a few things in between. But with that being said, I wanted to just give a quick overview.
Dan, real quick before you get started. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat as Dan is presenting here. There'll be some natural breaks in his presentation where we can address them, and then there'll be certainly some time at the end for Q&A. So enter all your questions into the chat, and we'll get to them when we can.
Yep, absolutely. Throw those questions in the chat box. I'll try to keep this as conversational as possible. Cool, but this presentation is designed to help Excel users, so basically most people, as they begin to use Tableau. So it's not going to be this one-to-one match showing you how something's done in Excel, how something's done in Tableau. We're just going to talk about the similarities and the differences more generally speaking. So with that being said, let's talk about what Excel is and how it compares to Tableau. So Excel contains spreadsheets, and the orientation of the cells is very important. So in Tableau, it's pivot-based, and the orientation of the fields themselves is important. So you still have cells, but think of them more as a unique combination of dimensions and the measures containing them, as opposed to the cells that you can reference in Excel. And I'll show you guys really what this means throughout the conversation, but it's really important to know that try not to think of Tableau as being cell referential, rather field referential. So you're referencing subcategory or product or profit, as opposed to D7 or C10, whatever this is. So data input with Excel is very easy, but data analysis is very difficult. That's kind of the nature of the game, and that's why Tableau came into play, because Tableau is very intuitive and powerful when it comes to visualizing your data, but the actual inputting of the data, the structuring of that data, can be kind of cumbersome. And if you don't know what you're doing, if you haven't had any experience with formatting this in the right way, then the analysis within Tableau, the visual piece of this, isn't going to be optimized. So it's very important before you begin visualizing in Tableau to make sure that the data is structured in a correct, optimal way. So that's why we're going to start with data preparation. So as it says here, data in Excel, more than likely, if you haven't talked about this before, is not organized for analytics. So in this example, this is a pretty standard Excel file, right? We've got states, municipalities, some years over here, and then a ton of white space. So Tableau doesn't like that. It can work with it, but it's not optimized. So ideally, Tableau is going to have the first row be the descriptors, so basically your column headers, and then each row following be the unique combination of all of your column headers. So I'm going to open up Tableau Desktop and show you an example of how you might approach connecting to an Excel file. bear with me 1 second. Alrighty, so I'm going to connect to a new data source. It's going to be Excel. Actually, let me do that a little bit more slowly. So if you've already connected to a data source, like I have here, so we've connected to Sample Superstore. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. If I want to add in an entirely new data source, I can come up here to New Data Source and connect just like I would any other file or data source. So I'm going to navigate to this example finance data file. I'm going to click on that. It's doing its thing over here in Tableau. And if I bring out, let's say, this file, see what it looks like under the hood. So it looks like we've got a lot of formatting up here at the top. And actually, you know what? I'm going to show you the original file because that's going to really hit home here. And the reason I think this is so important to spend time on is because this is what a lot of people come into contact with. There's nothing inherently wrong about this. It's just this is how Excel does things. And we know that, and that's why we've added a function called the data interpreter to get rid of a lot of this formatting up here at the top with one click. See, it brought it in exactly as the Excel file looks. So a bunch of nulls here. We've got the right info, but let's just use data interpreter. And we'll see what Tableau makes of this. And so the key thing to note here is that data interpreter might be able to clean your Excel file. It's not guaranteeing that it will, and I've run into some experiences where it doesn't do anything. But more often than not, if it's just some sort of formatting issue like this, then data interpreter is the way to go. So it cleaned it up. Now we're looking good for analysis within Tableau. So another thing I wanted to mention, this is pretty introductory stuff, but the difference between a dimension and a measure. So I'm going to switch to Sample Superstore. This is very important in terms of structuring your data and leveraging field references, right? So and all of your column headers, all of your categories that you have in your Excel file are going to be brought into Tableau as either a dimension or a measure. And so numeric information that you want to do math on, you know, take an average of this, sum this, subtract this from this, all of that sort of information is going to be natively brought in as a measure so that you can take, let's say, profit, and if I double click on this, we've got an aggregation of profit, right, this sum. So under the hood, these are just a bunch of different data points. These are a bunch of rows of data. But Tableau likes to aggregate things. So it's doing this based on a sum. And the idea from here is that once you've aggregated a numeric field that's going to be in the measures category down here, you want to break it apart by a categorical field. And so
hey, Dan,
dimensions.
Yep. One thing I want to add, just to mention on what Dan was saying in regards to the dimensions and measures. So this is one of the cases where Tableau is trying to think for us as much as possible to make it easy. But let's say, you know, for example, this isn't the case, but you saw a region under dimensions and you actually think it is a measure. You do have the ability to drag and drop, you know, region over to measures and convert that into a numeric field. So if you see something aligned incorrectly, you can do some, you know, a little manual manipulation in Tableau. So just want to make that clear.
Yep, he's exactly right. So let's say, for example, a good example of this is IDs. A lot of times because IDs are numeric, Tableau thinks you want to aggregate them, so it puts them into the measures category down here. Let's say profit is ID, you could just drag that up. And now profit's a dimension. So you can then break it down by your different profit points. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense because ideally you'd want to break it down by a category. So that one bar, that one aggregation is now 3 different pieces. Again, any questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat box. If this isn't making sense, we can easily go over it again. We've got plenty of time, so do not hesitate to do so. In the spirit of data structure, I was going to show another example of how to pivot data. So I'm going to connect to another Excel file. This one looks like this. So the first column we have is IDs. So this is great. We have a unique descriptor up here, IDs, and we've got all our unique actual IDs or agencies. Over here, we have Facebook, Google AdWords, Analytics, et cetera, basically a bunch of different organizations and some values associated for each ID. So when I analyze this in Tableau, I can see that all of my measures are shown as the different organizations because each one maintains a unique place within the data structure. They each have their own column. So a really important piece here is that you can still analyze things that aren't perfectly structured. And so it's on you to really make sure that you've done your due diligence in terms of structuring this in the right way. So I can bring things out like this and then break it down by the agencies. So it still works, but again, it's not optimized. So what we want to do here is basically combine all of these different organizations into one field called organizations so that I can bring out that one field and then start to analyze that. Because let's say, for example, I have a number of records and I wanted to, let's just say, put organizations onto color so I can break down this aggregation. I can't do that right now because they all exist as separate fields. But if I come back here to the data source pane, I can multi-select all of these fields and essentially convert them into rows as opposed to columns. So the way I do that is I multi-select all of them and then I pivot. And so for those heavy Excel users out there, this is the exact same thing as a transpose in Excel. So basically just flipping it on its head. Now I can say company or org or whatever it might be, and the value or the sales or the profit or whatever it really is in your case. If I show all my rows, I can see now that as I go through, I've got all of those companies existing as unique rows of data. And so one thing to keep in mind is that your agencies, this field is going to duplicate a lot because you now, instead of having one row for Facebook, have however many times you pivoted. So in this case, it was 20. So basically, we've duplicated this by 20 in terms of the actual row count. But what's great is that now, when I have my number of records, I can break it down by the company like I wanted to, right? I can partition this and categorize the aggregation. I can switch this up. Let's bring it over here. Let's throw value on color, see what happens. I find an outlier, Google Analytics. Fantastic. This is a very, very brief introduction into how you might start analyzing your data within Tableau. And this is something you couldn't have done in the previous format.
Hey, we do have a question on the pivot you just did, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get the unique count? I see lines are duplicated when you use pivot.
Sorry. Was this in the chat box or was this?
Yeah, but it went to me directly. Here, I'll put it in your you. All right, just send it over to you, Dan.
How do we get the unique count? I see lines are duplicated when you use pivot. So the way to do this in Tableau desktop is let's remove the pivot, start off with this one. So there's a few ways to do this. So you can type in I always just say like 1,000,000, and then it will default to the amount of rows you actually have. So if you say a number that's high enough, you're likely not going to hit above that. So right now in this example, we have just under 1,200 rows. And if I go to sheet 2, or let's just open a whole new one, if I get out my number of records, I see that's the same number, because number of records is a field that comes natively with Tableau Desktop, and it's a way of just basically counting what's in your data set. So that's always a quick and easy way to do this. Right, so I got just under 1,200. When I perform that pivot, let's multi-select all these guys. Again, go back to the pivot. Now I have 20,000. I can confirm that by looking at my number of records now. Just about 20,000. Does that answer the question? And if I don't hear anything, I will assume that's a yes.
Yep, agreed.
Cool. Additionally, we have a standalone product that came out recently called Tableau Prep, which allows you to do things like this, the structuring, the counting of the rows, the validation, in a much more streamlined process. So I won't go into that today, but I wanted to put that out there that exists.
On that, Dan, everybody on the call, we will be covering Tableau Prep in a couple weeks. So like Dan mentioned, that is a new tool that new product that we recently released to help you prepare your data. So we'll be covering that, I believe, not next week, but the week after. So
cool. That is really exciting. It's a fantastic tool. I really love it. So just be prepared for that. It's really cool. Cool. So we talked about pivoting. We talked about duplication, things like that. Let's go back into the slide deck and talk about how you might do some math in Tableau, a standard calculation. So this is an example of a very simple calculation, basically multiplying two different values and then summing the result. So let me hop to that actual sheet, show you what's going on. Basically, we have an average discount. So we've taken our average field, or our discount field, and aggregated it based on an average. We have our sales as well. Nothing too crazy here. We've just summed those up. And then we have sales times discount. So let's see what that looks like. Pretty standard stuff. You might think, oh, this is very easy to do in Tableau, and it is. We use very simple syntax. A lot of it's very similar to Excel. It's not exactly the same, but it's going to seem very familiar as you start getting familiar with the tool. Let's take another example. Let's look at calculations 2. Let's go to the sheet, see what's going on under the hood. And so this one's a little bit different because we're talking about ratios here, right? So we've done the same thing with sum of sales, but then we have sum of sales triangle. It's the same exact thing, but there's a triangle. So what does this mean? Sum of total sales. This means that we have a table calculation. And so a table calculation is, think of it as doing additional math on top of the aggregation, right? So we've aggregated in exactly the same way, right? It's still a sum of sales, but we've taken a percent of the total. So you can do that very simply on a field like this, a continuous field, by coming down here to quick table calculation and selecting one of these guys. So in this case, it was a percent of total. So I can edit this. I'll see exactly how this was made. And we did a percent of total going down. So it knows that we want to do this percent of total for all of these rows. Now, if I did it across, that doesn't make any sense because it's taking it by appliances, which is obviously 100% if only appliances are in the mix. But if we do it table down, it takes into account every subcategory. So it looks like sales versus category average also has a triangle indicating that it is a table calculation. When I edit this though, as I do right here, it doesn't look like this is an out-of-the-box table calculation, like this one was, right? It says percent of total. These are the out-of-the-box ones. That's because a lot of times you can make table calculations in a unique way, in a more customized way. So let's look at what sales versus category average actually looks like. So in this case, we've done the sum of sales divided by window average sum of sales. So what does this window average mean? It's basically saying, give me the average expression within the window. So that means everything that's on the view right now. So it's completely dependent on what you've dragged onto the view. So if you drag something else on here, like region, the nature of this calculation changes entirely. It's now calculating with region as a part of the equation. If I take it back off, it changes back to what we had before. So that's a very important concept, the concept of a window. Also, if we come down here to table calculations, we have a full list of every function that could be used in any sort of your customized table calculations. But the important thing to note is that it's always dependent on what's in the view. So let me switch back to my other workbook and show you a really simple example of a profit ratio. So I'm going to delete this one, delete profit ratio. And I will say, whoops, actually I'm going to not do that. Just going to open up a new sample superstore. So we've got profit, we have sales, and we have things like categories, subcategories. So let's say, for example, we want to find the profit ratio for each category. So let me drag out category. We'll drag out, actually, I'll just start off with the equation. So we'll open up a new calculated field, and we'll call this guy profit ratio. And so you might be thinking to yourself, okay, great, let me just take my profit and divide it by my sales. Give me a pretty standard profit ratio. This is the right calculation. And let me do this by subcategory, actually. I'm going to take that profit ratio and drag it onto text. Change this to a percentage as well. And it looks like something went wrong here. So accessories, we're looking at 17,000%, almost negative 8,000%. This one's especially high, 20,000%. This just isn't right. Something's totally wrong here. We can look under the hood, see what's going on in the underlying data. So it looks like the profit ratios computed are pretty, they look fine. So what exactly is going wrong here? What's going wrong is that we've computed the profit ratio at a row level, right? So if we come back here, these profit ratios exist at the row level. But what we've done here is we've aggregated these together for each subcategory. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, you wouldn't add ratios together. You wouldn't add 8% plus 10% plus 15. That just gives us no value. But that's what we've done here because we computed at the row level first. So in order to, resolve this issue, we have to come back here to the profit ratio and aggregate the profit first, as well as the sales. And now it's taking that aggregation of all of the profit per subcategory, dividing by all of the sales per subcategory. So if I apply that, it's going to break it real quick, but if I drag it back on, these are more realistic profit ratios. You can see that it changed as well from a sum of profit ratio to an AGG of profit ratio. So this means that whatever going on in the calculated field is already aggregated, so you can't do it again. Throw this onto color, see which ones pop out. Looks like bookcases, supplies, tables, not doing so great. Labels, paper, doing just fine. Any questions? Looks like we are all clear. If anything does pop up, feel free to shoot it in the chat box.
Do have one, Dan, actually.
Oh yeah, cool.
Can you do VLOOKUP formulas in Tableau? I wasn't sure if you're going to cover that later or not.
Yeah, we're gonna touch on that. So we have something called a lookup function in Tableau. So it's very similar to a VLOOKUP, but it's field referential as opposed to cell referential. So I'll show you guys what that means in a second. And I actually think that was next on the list, so that's a really good question. Alrighty, so let's hop back into the slide deck. Perfect timing. So next up is the idea of a lookup versus a VLOOKUP. So the lookup function in Tableau allows you as the end user to basically traverse your result set to return aggregate values of elements at either a relative or absolute position. So you can either do give me this value from 2 behind or give me the value from the very beginning, right? So relative versus absolute positions. So the use of a positive or negative offset value is relative to the current row, while the absolute positions, so using the first or last functions, is a absolute position in the result set. And I know that was a lot, so I'll show you guys really what that means. So let's hop back into this sheet. But before I do that, actually, I wanted to just touch on the syntax. So the Excel function is a VLOOKUP, right? You have your value, your table, your index number, where, et cetera, et cetera. You guys are probably very familiar with this. With a lookup, it's similar, but it's the aggregate calculation, the index number, so the reference, where the aggregate calculation is any valid calculation. So let's go to this actual sheet. So in this example, we have sales right here. Nothing done on this quite yet, but we have a bunch of these table calculations indicated by the triangles. So that's an important note. This lookup function that we're talking about is a table calculation because it's dependent on what is in the view. So if we look at sales 2 cells below, so this one, you can see that this number is the same as this one. This one's the same as this one, and so on and so forth. Let's look at what that calculation looks like. So we've done a lookup of the sum of sales minus 2. So for this one, it's looking back to nothing there. This one, looking back to, again, nothing there. Finally, when it looks back to, we get this number. So if we look at what the blurb about lookup says, again, it returns the value of a given expression in a target row. It's the relative offset from the current row. In addition to this -2, we also have the ability to do absolute positions, so first or last. So that's how we get things like this. So 2015, it's always going to be the first one. Just above 300,000, it's always going to be that last one. So let me show you what that looks like. In this case, we've done the same thing. We're just looking at the sum of sales, but saying, always give me the first one. So it's always going to give me the first one. This one, it's just going to be last, right? And this table isn't especially useful in terms of functionality, how you might use Tableau in your daily life, but it's meant to show off how you can use each one independent of one another. Realistically, though, in the way I've seen them used many times in my experience is these work in conjunction with each other. So you'd have it last as long as including like a lookup to -2. So it gets a lot more complex than this, but this is just to showcase the functionality of all this. With that being said, let me hop to the next lookup example, something a little bit more realistic. So in this case, we've got year-over-year growth. You might be saying that's not a lookup, but it actually is, because when I selected the year-over-year growth quick table calculation, so I can do that just like this. You know, it exists down here as a standard quick table calc. That actually uses the lookup functionality behind the scenes. So when I say edit this table calculation, I can see exactly what's going on here. Now I can see the year-over-year growth from 2011 to 2012 was 19%, from 2012 to 2013, 33, and so on and so forth. Let me show you an example of how you might make sense of all this after this webinar series. So let's say, for example, you've got profits and you've got subcategory. And you want to add something in like a running total, let's say. Like I just said with the year-over-year growth, a lot of these quick table calculations that are out of the box use these table calculations like lookup, but they don't show you how it's made, right? Even if you say edit table calculation, it's not showing you what the lookup was. What you can do is I'm going to hold down Control, which duplicates this pill. I can drag it over to the measures, and I'll say, new calc. Now I can edit this and see how that was calculated. So in this case, a running sum of profit uses the running sum function. Let me do the same thing with my year-over-year growth. Do this based on month. In this case, I'll just do a quick, clear this table calc. So simple year-over-year growth here. Again, let's drag it over here. We'll say calc 5. And we'll edit this. This is the actual calculation that Tableau wrote for us with year-over-year growth. So we can see here that it said, give me the sum of profit and look back 1, divide that number by the absolute value of that same look back value of -1. So this is really a great way to teach yourself Tableau, especially these more complex table calculations. And so we've wrapped a few other functions in the mix, things like 0 if null, absolute values. And what's great is that anywhere along the way, it gives you a nice blurb about the function and an example of it being used. Awesome. So let's talk about formatting while we still have some time. In this example, we've got sales and profit broken down by the months of the year, but we've formatted it in 2 different ways. So in this example, if I hop to the sheet, so does the -1 indicate which field I need to look up? So the -1 is the offset, but if we look back at this example, any one of these, the sum of the sales is what field you're indicating you want to look up, right? So if you look at the lookup, you have the expression plus the offset. So simply speaking, that's the kind of the building blocks of a lookup. It can get more complicated, but it's always going to contain the expression and the offset. Let me get through, just because we're running up on time a little bit, let me go through the conditional formatting examples, and then we can talk about this stuff if we have time. So in this example, like I was saying, we have the same idea where we have two measures being formatted in two separate ways, but one of them is using these bins of formatting. So we either have below, meets, or exceeds the expectations, and the profit has a scale. So how does this happen? What is the difference between these two? Let's open up a new sheet and just break this down by profit over subcategories. So what we see people doing a lot, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't tell people anything, is coloring something like profit subcategory based on a dimension. So if I drag the same thing, product subcategory, onto color, this doesn't look too bad, but what does it really show you as an end user? You can already see that these are separate product subcategories. You don't need the color on top of that to indicate the differences between the subcategories. So in this case, it makes more sense to put something like a KPI on this. In this case, we've basically manually defined 3 different bins. So if sum of sales is this, if sum of sales is this, give me these 3 different options. So it's the same idea as giving me different bins, right? So in this case, I have like 15 different bins. Sales KPI is going to do the same thing, but it is a little bit more analytically impactful. You're actually showing your end user something, right? So I have profit on here. I don't even see sales in the visualization, but by adding it to color, I can make some sense of these different subcategories. So typically what we do is put that onto color. And I'll change this to an average. And so what that does is because I've brought out something continuous, something that gives us an axis, we see that scale, right? We've got 4% all the way to 5%, as opposed to giving us discrete values, like if I brought out product category. So the key here is to always be cognizant of whether your pill is blue or whether it's green. So if something is blue, that means it's categorical, it's discrete. You're using this to break down an aggregation of something down here. When a field is green, that means that it's continuous. Any of the values within my profit field can assume anything within the range, anything within these values. So in addition to formatting based on a KPI or based on a continuous field, we can also do it based on things like shape, along with color. So you're not limited in any way as to what you can do, but it's always nice to know some additional ways of formatting. So in this case, sales status, let's drag it onto color first. So this is basically what we'd had before, right? We'll change the shape here. I can flick through and see where the colors add up. I can also add this onto the shapes card. And what that does is instead of using color, it's using these actual shapes to indicate good or bad or non-existent. I can do 2 at the same time. So if I hold down Control, it duplicates the pill. And now I'm looking at 2 different ways of formatting in the same view. You can customize your shapes. In this case, I've used this color palette. I can use bars. I'll assign that palette. I'll apply this. Looks a little bit different. I can do weather if this is something you're interested in. You can also use something that's not out of the box in Tableau. It's a simple process. It requires accessing the Tableau repository. but you can import custom shapes. If there's something that's specific to a client, maybe some sort of icon people are very familiar with, certainly a possibility. So we can always follow up with some resources as to how to do that if that sounds like it's something of interest to people. Last thing we have on the table is the idea of totaling. So in Tableau, totaling, again, is dependent on what fields you've brought out into the view. So in this example, let's go to this total right here. And actually, I'm just going to start from scratch. So product, subcategory, region, sales profit. Product, subcategory. Drag out some regions real quick, and we have sales. So no totals right here. In order to add these totals, we can come up here to analysis, come down to totals, and you have a few different options here. So we can add row grand totals, column grand totals, rows to the left, and subtotals. Let's see what each one of these does. So row grand totals allows you to see each one per row, right? Let's add something else. The column grand totals, it's going to do exactly what it sounds like. Add the totals down here per column. It's going to give you the total as well for your other grand total. If I want to see per category, I can do that by adding subtotals. So now we've got all sorts of totals on here. Whoops, I did not mean to select that. Let's go through each other one. Row totals to the left. I can switch up the view here. Column totals on top. And we have some additional options as to how you might total. So you can total based on the sum, which is what we have here. We can do an average, a min, a max. Switch this to an average. Changes everything up. But totaling in Tableau is really that simple. And if anybody has any questions related to that, shoot them my way. So that about sums up what we have ready to present today. So now we can address the Q&A portion of this.
Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. Questions, feel free to enter them to the chat, and we'll get to them as we can. I know we addressed a lot. I'm just looking through here to make sure I didn't forget anything. I'm not seeing any questions over here. Are you seeing any directly to you, Dan, that we haven't covered? Oh, can we, all right, we got one. Can we look up data between two data sources?
I also got one on grand totals. I'll answer this one real quick.
Yep.
So you can't do that. It's relative on what's in the view. There's a way, I mean, you could write a calculation that gives you a total based on specifically what you want. But the reason you can't do that is because if I have totals, on the view like so, everything changes when I add in a new dimension, right? So the grand totals are totally different now. So if you wanted the grand total for all office supplies, you would write some sort of calculation that would be, if category equals office supplies, then give me a total. So this is essentially the same thing. Whoops, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. But you would write something like that where you would manually define it. The next question was what again, Mike? I don't think I saw that one.
Can you look up data between two data sources?
When you say look, oh, like VLOOKUP.
Hold on, we actually have a follow-up on your last question, I think, before you get to that one. From Ken, does that mean one cannot have multiple fact tables?
Fact tables in the sense of like a star schema. Is that what you're thinking?
Correct.
There's what brings you to that conclusion? I'm not fully understanding why you wouldn't be able to have two.
Here, yeah, I would agree. I think we definitely can comment about using multiple tables.
Was that kind of, I'm trying to think of the best way to approach this. So let me connect to something totally different, which actually contains a fact table. So I'm going to go to SQL Server, sign into our demo instance, and in this example, we have a fact table along with all of the other ones. Oh, whoops, let me go to star schema real quick.
He just said one other thing. In other words, do we build relationships between tables in Tableau?
Yes, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. So let's say, for example, you've got your standard star schema. You're connected to SQL Server. I've got my fact table here. And as we have fact tables, they don't contain much other than the actual transactions or whatever your fact table might be pertaining to. But let's say we want to include all of the information related to products. In that case, you would also bring out your product table. And from here, from the data source pane, that's where you define your relationship between these two tables. So in this case, it's automatically done an inner join based on product key. If you want everything in the fact table, switch that to a left. But this is how you would quickly define the relationships between the two. So if you have an Excel file with multiple tabs, you would have to bring in each one of those tabs. So they would appear over here as different sheets. When it's a database, they appear as different tables. But short answer is yes, you have to define the relationships. Again, stay tuned for Tableau Prep because all of this sort of stuff is made much easier and easier to understand too. So just kind of stay tuned and look out for Tableau Prep.
Cool.
Does that answer the question though?
Yep, it does. All right, so the question that I was asking prior to that one was, can we look up data between two data sources similar to a VLOOKUP functionality?
So if the relationship is defined, let's do something like this. Actually, hold on.
That could also come into the fact of joining the data prior to putting it into Tableau, therefore it is all there. But
so if I wanted to look up something from here, I have to join on this, and then let's say profit of sales. So you can from two different data sources, like so, right? We just brought in this one. It might not make sense because this is something, oh, it actually did. So this is a good example. It's brought in something from an entirely new data source, that SQL source. This example isn't hard and fast, but it proves the point that you certainly can. But like Mike said, you have to make sure that the structure makes sense, that everything is in place, or else these lookups are going to get very, very messy very quickly.
cool. I don't think I'm seeing any other questions on, yep, he says thanks. I don't think I'm seeing any other questions on my end, Dan. So I'll just double check one more time on your end to make sure we didn't miss anything, but I think we are good to go.
Yep, I do not see anything. So with that being said, thank you everyone for joining. I hope this was helpful. And yeah, stay tuned for Tableau prep. It's really exciting stuff, and I wish you all the best.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, thank you so much for presenting on this, Dan. Hope you guys all found this valuable. I did send out this exact deck that Dan was talking about on the call yesterday, and I will include that in my follow-up again later this afternoon. But just a reminder, for future sessions and future or past recordings, it is all located on the site that I created for you guys. I'm going to pull the ball back from you real quick, Dan. Actually, can you pass me the ball? I don't know if I can pull it from you. Oh, no, we're good. Nope. All right. Well, just a reminder, everybody, the recordings and future sessions are on the Point Drive, so you guys do have access to that. It's all located right here. So feel free to go out here, register, and then take a look at the recordings, or if you have want some more information on the Viz contest. So again, thank you everybody for your time today. We're so nice. We're giving you 3 minutes back in your day. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.